Hello, everyone. From St. John's, a very windy St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. My name is Janet Herron, and I am an Alumni Engagement Officer at Memorial and your host for today's event. I am here with two special guests, Dale Jarvis, MA 2011, Executive Director of Heritage NL, and Dr. Daniel Peretti, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Folklore. I know those of you attending can't see who else is in the room for the event, but we do have a full house. We have over 200 registrants, and we've got over 50 people right now in the room, and more are joining every second. So we are absolutely delighted about that. We will begin today's event with, as always, with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. So here at the Office of Alumni Engagement, we are focused on offering many ways for alumni to connect with Memorial from anywhere in the world. And we're working diligently to create opportunities to celebrate, socialize, mentor, learn, and advance both your career and hopefully improve your life. MUNalum 101 was born out of the need to reach out to alumni during the height of the pandemic. It has since evolved to become a cornerstone of our alumni engagement activities and offering the latest information on key topics from Memorial University's own experts. Embarking on new and exciting ways to build relationships within our Memorial family of over 100,000 members is absolutely vital to our evolution as an institution. Alumni are the drivers of economic, social, and cultural development across this province and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion about the unique holiday traditions of Newfoundland and Labrador and the latest research into the legend of Santa Claus. The depth and breadth of these traditions was a true revelation to me myself when I moved here from Ontario 14 years ago. And some might say I still believe in Santa. So I am personally really excited to hear today's presentations. Just a few housekeeping items. A brief Q&A will follow the presentations. I will be monitoring the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So please try to keep your questions short and sweet, and I encourage listeners and watchers to post your questions as soon as possible. Don't leave them to the last minute, as we have a very full program and only will have a limited time to take questions. Attendees are not able to unmute your microphone or turn on your videos, and you won't be able to see other people's messages in the chat, but they are out there. We are streaming live and we are recording this session, and you will receive a link to the event in a follow-up email. It is my great pleasure to officially introduce the first of our special guests today. Dale Gilbert Jarvis is a storyteller, author, and folklorist living and working in Newfoundland, Canada. He holds a BSc in Anthropology Archaeology from Trent University and an MA in Folklore from Memorial. For many years, he oversaw Heritage NL's Intangible Cultural Heritage Office, which helps communities to safeguard their traditional culture, and he is also a past president of the Newfoundland Historic Trust. Dale has contributed as a board member and volunteer to many local arts and heritage organizations. He regularly teaches workshops on oral history, cultural documentation, folklore project management, and public folklore programming. A former newspaper columnist, he is also the author of several books, including most recently On This Day, 365 Tales of History, Mystery, and More. And he is the founder of the famous St. John's Haunted Hike and a tireless promoter of local traditions. So I'm now going to load up Dale's slides, and I'm going to turn the presenting duties over to him. And I'm going to mute myself and Daniel and turn off our videos just so you're not distracted by us. So here we go. Over to Dale. Yep. Okay, and Daniel.
Thank you very much, and welcome. I'm tuning in from a very windy corner in downtown St. John's. The wind is howling at the eaves of the old Newman building where I am today. So it is a great delight to talk a little bit about Christmas traditions here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm just waiting for Janet to pass over the slides. What's that?
Sorry, just one little, just a little, I just need to load that up.
There we go, perfect.
There we go. I'm giving you the controls.
Thanks, Janet. So today I get to talk about one of my favorite things, and that is Christmas traditions in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm kind of focusing on maybe some of the lesser known aspects of some of our Christmas traditions here in Newfoundland. I think when we talk about Christmas traditions here, everyone kind of is familiar with some of them, certainly mummering, this disguised house visiting tradition, which has a very long, complicated history in the province, is one that many, many people know of. And it's certainly, in its own right, one of the strange Newfoundland and Labrador traditions that we have around Christmas. But I figured since we often talk about the 12 days of Christmas, I'd go through, in no particular order, and give you 12 kind of a little bit unique ways that we have celebrated Christmas in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think the important thing to note just going in is that when we talk about traditions, oftentimes we are talking about things that, are international in some ways, but in other ways are very much localized traditions. And certainly what we have for Christmas traditions in Newfoundland and Labrador vary wildly from place to place in the province, and traditions that are common in St. Mary's Bay are maybe not common in Nain or Hopedale, and vice versa. So we'll touch on some of those. Just to start off with, I think I wanted to, just starting off with this idea of having your Christmas. And when I've been doing some research on house visiting traditions in Newfoundland, there was a tradition that was kind of a common urban tradition, and possibly some St. John's people who are listening in might be familiar with this. And it was kind of a house visiting tradition that was very popular amongst children. And the idea was that you would go door to door and ask your neighbors if you could come in and see their Christmas tree. And so you would go into the house, you would sit down in front of the neighbor's Christmas tree, not necessarily someone that you knew, and you'd say, "Oh, miss, that's some Christmas tree. That's a really nice Christmas tree." And then the expectation was that the lady of the house would bring you, something sweet to drink and something good to eat. And then you might continue on down the road and do the same thing. "Oh, miss, that's a really nice Christmas tree." So it was kind of a form of trick-or-treating almost that happened at Christmas time. And it's something that we'll see in some of our other traditions as well. And so house visiting in itself, even in an uncostumed, unstructured sort of way, is really a part of Christmas traditions in the province. And mummering is part of this house visiting tradition, but it expresses itself in a whole variety of different ways. This is a photo that I love from the 1950s, 1952, I think, downtown St. John's. Beautiful tree, this. This is another photo that I love. This is a photo from the West Coast, and where these people have had a costumed Christmas party. So again, we get into that idea of dressing up and going house to house, but it's not necessarily a disguised tradition in that faces are visible and you are able to go and have a party in costume at Christmas time. And the word mummer in Newfoundland, while since the 1980s has come to specifically mean a disguised house visiting tradition, the word to mummer in Newfoundland English just means to dress up. So often you will hear older people, for example, saying, "Oh, the mummers were out at Halloween this year," just indicating someone who was dressed up. So lots of opportunities to dress up and act foolish at various times of the year in the province. One of the other traditions that I've been doing a little bit of work with over the last couple of years is another type of house visiting tradition. And in particular, we've been doing some work at Heritage NL with the community of Heart's Delight, Islington. There was a great tradition there of singing Christmas carols, in particular, two very old English Christmas carols, one of which is known by a variety of names, but one of them is A Virgin Unspotted. And these were two ancient Christmas carols that persisted in Heart's Delight, Islington, and were told right up until present time. Typically, the tradition would involve a group of men in the community who originally would go around on Christmas Eve. They would start after Christmas Eve church service, and they would go to every house in the community and sing these two carols, unaccompanied carols. They would let themselves into the house, they would sing with great reverence these two carols, and then continue on to the next house, sometimes not getting back until the very wee hours of the morning. And along the way, there might be a little drop or two that got tossed down someone's throat. One of the women we interviewed in Heart's Delight, Islington, said something that I think will always stick with me about Christmas. She said, Christmas was for children and men. Women never got to have any fun at Christmas. They were too busy doing all the work and cooking and cleaning, while the men were the ones that got to go out and parade and do all these other things. The two Christmas carols, as I said, are quite old, and they have persisted in that joint community, Heart's Delight, Islington, and it was a much more widespread tradition. All along that part of Trinity Bay, people were involved in that tradition. The idea of singing these two carols from door to door. Greens Harbor, for example, was another community in the area in Trinity Bay where that tradition was maintained for quite some time. And Heart's Delight Islington has been having a bit of a resurgence of interest. This is members of the community and the local heritage society gathering together to rehearse these two old English carols a number of years ago. And just before everything got shut down with COVID, we actually had an event at the Rooms here in St. John's where members of the Heart's Delight Islington community came and performed the carols and talked about the significance in the community. What would Christmas be without food? And we have some certain assumptions today about what that might mean. Things like turkey dinner, for example, being fairly new to Newfoundland. And many people have very, very different ideas of what you might serve for Christmas Eve. One of my cousins, for example, she has a fabulous story about her mother, Aunt Betty Slaney, making turkey neck soup for all the mummers that would come. So for them, the turkey necks were the great delicacy, and she would always have a great bowl of turkey neck soup. A few years ago, myself and fellow folklorist Gillian Gould were in Carbonear talking to people about Christmas memories. And one of the questions I asked a group of seniors was, what smell do you associate with Christmas? What kind of food smell do you associate with Christmas? And one lady said, oh, she said, my favorite Christmas smell growing up was pig's blood, because that was the time of year where her father would slaughter a fresh pig. They'd have fresh meat for Christmas, unlike the rest of the winter, and they would make blood pudding. So for her, a Christmas meal wouldn't be complete without blood pudding or black pudding. Another record I found for Christmas, a very traditional Christmas dish in central part of Newfoundland, was this, which is deer tongue, caribou tongue. So imagine serving this to your children on Christmas Day instead of the turkey dinner they're expecting. One of the traditions which I sadly seems to have kind of died out in the province is the idea of mummers on ice. This is a great photograph that was shared around a year or two ago by the Conception Bay Museum in Harbour Grace. And you have this fabulous crowd of costumed youngsters out skating around the pond in Harbour Grace. And having done a little bit of digging, this was apparently a tradition of sorts. At the late kind of Victorian, early Edwardian period in Newfoundland, this was something that happened. In St. John's, for example, this is from 1892, talking about a grand carnival where there would be mummers of the olden time. This is another tradition. I think we talk about Christmas in very nostalgic terms. We're always thinking that the Christmases of years ago were better somehow than the Christmases of today. And people have been doing that for 100 and whatever years. But certainly people were out costumed up and skating around in St. John's. This is another example. This was I think a 2 or 3 column news item in the Daily Colonist, 1891, about one of these costumed skating parties for Christmas. I think it's one we should bring back. One of the words that I love in Newfoundland English that has kind of died out in modern English is the word swab. It survives in modern English. If you've ever, tried to clean out your ear with one of those little things with a cotton tip, you'll be familiar with the word swab. A swab is any kind of implement, a pole or a stick with something kind of attached at the end. And we have this great engraving here showing kind of a mid-19th century scene, the Basilica and the BIS, the old BIS there. And you can see these mummers parading through the streets. And they have this mummer right in the very front there has a swab, which in his instance is, or her instance is, a pig's bladder, probably filled with stones and tied to a stick. Another great tradition of mummering past was, of course, the propensity of mummers to go around and beat people they met upon the street. And we see this in a lot of Christmas traditions around the world, this idea of beating people with sticks. And in Newfoundland, we have the swab that we always use. This is a photo. This actually isn't a Newfoundland photo in a sense. This is from Harrington Harbor on the lower North Shore. A Quebec island that was settled by Newfoundlanders. A great early 20th century photo here, and you can see this mummer with this very interesting swab there on the left, and then the middle little mummer with the revolver and the sealskin mask, which I also love. Another image here from the 1970s of these very hairy sort of bearskin mummers from the south coast of the island, all there carrying their swabs. Useful for knocking on doors to demand entrance, also good for beating up other mummers you might meet along the way with whom you had a beef earlier in the year. Number 6, speaking of sticks, another one of my favorite traditions, and that is a wren, St. Stephen's Day, the Wren Day. This is John Ryan, the late John Ryan here with his wren stick. There's a little tiny bird on the end of this stick. This is a very Irish tradition. It still persists in some very Irish Catholic communities in Conception Bay and St. Mary's Bay. It was as widespread as out in Boyd's Cove at one point, other parts of the province. The idea was that on St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, you would go around with your little bird from door to door, again, a house visiting tradition, sometimes for children, sometimes for men, and you would ask for money. Children would take the opportunity. This might be the one time of the year where they'd actually get some cash money. They'd go around sometimes to every house in the community, reciting a rhyme and getting some coins in return. When we started the Mummers Festival in 2009, this was one of the traditions that we were really interested in. This is an example by artist Grant Boland in St. Mary's Bay. The typical tradition was to have a little tree, a decorated tree that you would go around with. This is one of the Wren girls that we interviewed here. That's Ryan Davis up in the back. Dennis Flynn there in the black t-shirt, myself over on the right. This was the very first year of the Mummers Festival. The lovely lady in the middle is Honora Scaines, and you can go online to Memorial's Digital Archives Initiative, and you can listen to Honora singing the Wren song. She passed away shortly after we did this interview with her in 2009. And it is a tradition that you can learn more about this Thursday at the Rooms. We'll be doing an interview with Dennis Ryan and some other Wren boys and girls from up the Southern Shore. What do you do with all that leftover ribbon when Christmas is over, all those decorations that you've had up? Well, you don't want things to go to waste. You're going to use those ribbons to make your ribbon fool costume. This was a very specific, regionally specific type of mummering, probably with ties to possibly Morris dancing traditions. It persisted for a very long time north of St. John's, so places like Flat Rock and Torbay and Pooch Cove. I think this one is actually a Flat Rock photo here, as is this one. You can see the men here much beribboned, and this was again expressed in a number of different ways. This is some more modern examples based on examples from Pooch Cove. There was another tradition that always took place on Old Christmas Day in parts of Conception Bay called Teak Night, where people would actually take down their Christmas decorations and fix them. Boys would kind of hang them over their shoulders like sashes, and then using their swab would go around and beat other children on the streets. And it was a very much an Irish Catholic versus English Protestant sort of tradition. What would Christmas be without a bit of cross-dressing? Certainly the mummers that we know today, especially with the popularity of the mummer song, what would a mummer be without a bra, whether or not it was male or female? This idea of upending social norms and expectations at the end of the calendar year, or something that date back to the Middle Ages, if not before. And it's certainly something that people express with great delight here in the province, this idea of playing with gender. Another fabulous word from Newfoundland English, which I think is derived from the Irish, is oonchick. And not a word that a lot of people use anymore, but there were people who remembered oonchicks being specifically kind of a gendered type of mummer, where there was a bit of transgression, you know, men becoming women, women becoming men, to the point where the line between those two, the gender binary, just didn't really exist when it came to oonchicks. So you might be dealing with a man, you might be dealing with a woman, you could be dealing with some sort of creature halfway in between. So cross-dressing, still a very strong part of our Christmas traditions. One that we don't see as much anymore, perhaps with good reason, is the tradition of blackface at Christmas. Not something that we would normally associate with Christmas time, but there was a very particular type of regional mummering style, which again has a very specific word for it, and that is a derby. A derby, it can have a number of meanings. It can refer to an almost supernatural creature, a black sort of faced creature. In places like Avondale, Conception Harbor, boys would take corks, heat them up in the oven or the wood stove until they had turned black, and then blacken their faces, and then go door to door. This was a tradition that would start as early as the end of October and continue right on up to Christmas. Again, sometimes we think of Christmas as being kind of the 12 days of Christmas, but these sorts of traditions would start as early as October and sometimes go right into February. Christmas was a very serious long-term commitment in Newfoundland of old. And it is a tradition that has, you know, kind of comparable traditions in other parts of the world. This is an example from Cornwall here. There is a Cornish tradition of these kind of black-faced mummers that go around at Christmas time. And this is an example from Winterton, again, in the 1950s. So ideas around gender could be flipped, ideas around race could be flipped as well at Christmas time. And you can see that here in this picture from Winterton. We have this black-faced mummer down on the bottom left, and kind of up center we have a very kind of stereotypical Chinese Fu Manchu faced man there. But my favorite mummer in this photo, if you look closely, is actually the person kind of right towards the center that has a strainer or a colander of some kind over its face. We have a great tradition in the province of Christmas beasts, strange creatures that only come out at Christmas time. And one of the things that we've seen, again, a bit of a resurgence around is the hobby horse tradition. This was a tradition that took place during the 12 days in certain parts of the province, on the Labrador Straits, and in certain communities where people would parade around with the head of a horse and a kind of a misshapen horse's body. Kind of the element of unrestrained chaos. Like a hobby horse would go into people's houses and do all kinds of mischief, get the dogs all worked up, you know, shut the lights on and off. There's a reference to a hobby horse in one community seizing a burning junk out of a wood stove and brandishing it around, and the house actually catching on fire. How's that for your Christmas present there? Hobby horses, I think, are probably the most common example of this. And again, we've been doing work with the Mummers Festival over the past decade or so to bring this tradition back to a certain extent. Hobby horses were kind of the most common beast, but there were all sorts of other creatures that would appear at Christmas time. Hobby bulls and goats. I did a great interview a number of years ago with John Davidge, Bud Davidge's brother, who wrote the Mummers song, and he had a story about skinning a ram and going around disguised as this ram at Christmas time. It was a time of year, like our story about blood pudding, when people would slaughter animals getting ready for the winter. And then people would use those skins in a variety of ways. And I know that people have gone mummering with moose skins and whatnot. Lots of very disturbing stories in the MUN Folklore and Language archives about people dressing up as various animals, using various animal parts to go around door to door. And certainly with the Mummers Parade in St. John's, we've seen all kinds of fabulous beasts out parading around at Christmas time once again. And this is a tradition, again, that has some deep roots. Some people may recognize this fabulous image by Newfoundland artist David Blackwood of the kind of bird-headed mummer. The room's collection of mummering-related artifacts has a really fabulous bird mask that was worn by mummers kind of early, mid-20th century as well. So it's a tradition that maybe isn't as common, probably, again, very regionally specific, but this idea that animals took on special significance at Christmas time. You know, there's always these stories that people tell about animals kneeling down or speaking or praying on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning. So it's a time of year when animals maybe also transgress their normal boundaries, and certainly that's been a part of our house visiting traditions here. Number 11, what would Christmas be without a good murder, a good thwacking of someone? And going back to this image, you know, violence was really a huge part of mummering traditions right up until the mid 19th century. Very famously in Newfoundland around the 1860s, there was a murder in Bay Roberts, the murder of Isaac Mercer. Here's local author Mike Flynn standing in front of the murder gate in Bay Roberts, where a gentleman was struck with an axe by mummers, and he died of his wounds. There had been attempts made to license mummering in the province, but following the murder, there was a proclamation issued that banned mummering. Some people are still under the idea that mummering is still illegal. The law stood on the books for a very, very long time, and it wasn't until the 1990s that a series of older laws were written off the books. So mummering is now legal, but it's only been legal for a very short number of years compared to the number of years where it was illegal in the province. And finally, for the 12th day of Christmas, the Feast of the Epiphany, one of my favorite, strangest, most terrifying Christmas traditions to come out of the province. And that is the tradition of Naliuk night along the north coast of Labrador. Naliuit are these strange creatures that come in off the ice, dressed all in furs, often shaking chains or carrying a stick of their own. And they come up and question Inuit children and ask them if they have been good over the year. And if they have not been good, they might get a beating. In more modern times, Naliuit come in on snowmobile and terrorize children in the communities. This is actually something that is growing in popularity in parts of Labrador. There's a great photo by photographer Jenny Williams, who's done a short film on Nali Night. So you can see these kind of terrifying creatures who have come in. And they visit on the Feast of the Epiphany, which is the day when the three wise men were said to have appeared bearing gifts. So quite often, the Naliuit will also come in bearing gifts for children. So they're a terrifying Christmas figure, but they also come with some good stuff as well. They know when you've been naughty and they know when you've been nice. So maybe Professor Peretti will talk about the history of kind of those wild men dressed all in furs who come to give us gifts. Just to finish off, these are a couple images here. As I said, the tradition has kind of grown to a certain extent as people have moved from the north coast of Labrador towards central Labrador and to the island. We've seen that tradition of Nalik Night now being done in places like Happy Valley Goose Bay. And I know there's even Naliuit that have appeared as far south as St. John's. These are some video stills that were sent to me by Gary Mitchell, great musician and storyteller from Makovic. And I think that is it for me. Those are our 12 strange Newfoundland and Labrador traditions. I'm sure there are many more. I could go on and on. But with that, I'll finish off and just wish you happy holidays.
Thank you, Dale. Wow, that was fascinating. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Peretti. I'm just going to pop his slides up here right now. And Daniel, we're going to, there you are. Daniel Peretti became a folklorist to understand the ways that narrative, ritual, and festivity affect people's lives. He holds a BA from Grand Valley State University, an MA from Indiana University, and a PhD from Indiana University. He believes his focus on mythology and legend seems the right sort of approach because these are often the most important narratives that people tell. Pursuing the idea of mythology in the United States, he began with a look at how the Greek god Prometheus appears in literature and popular culture. He proceeded to a study of Superman through fieldwork and textual analysis, and his current projects include case studies of festivals based on legendary figures, as well as a long-term exploration of Santa Claus in legend and ritual behavior. So welcome, Dr. Daniel Peretti.
Thank you, Janet. And thanks, Dale, too. That was just outstanding. I learned a lot there. Really great stuff. So I'm going to talk about Santa Claus more specifically, but I'm also going to go a little more broadly with some global traditions, a few here and there. And I think the right place to start a talk like this is with St. Nicholas, because that's where it all begins. This was a man who, well, actually, he was known as the boy bishop, living in a town called Myra in what's now Turkey back in the 3rd century. When the bishop died there, the conclave priests didn't know how to replace them, so they waited for a sign, and the sign happened in one of their dreams. They were told to make the bishop the next person who knocked on the church door, which happened to be Nicholas, who was about 10 years old at the time. He was an orphan, but he'd been left very well off by his parents, and he set about performing some not random acts of kindness exactly, but he was kind of keeping to himself as he would distribute money and things throughout the city. Over time, this legend of Nicholas grew, and he became the patron saint of children because he resurrected some who were trying to be smuggled out of town after having been murdered and put in barrels of pork. He was also a patron saint of sailing. So a lot of people would pray to him. He's the most popular saint in the world, and more churches are dedicated to him than to anyone else, despite the fact that he has never been canonized. So St. Nicholas becomes the starting point for Santa Claus, and it takes a while maybe 1,500 years or so before the traditions begin to become recognizable as what we know today. And that happens later on in New York. So I want to talk about Santa Claus as a result of a number of historical forces acting on celebrations. What was really great about Dale's presentation was that he emphasized the public nature of a lot of these celebration traditions. And that is something that was, as he noted, really prominent in the past. Christmas was very much a public holiday. It was decided on by the Catholic Church in the 6th century. That would be formalized as December 25th, which used to be a Roman holiday called Saturnalia. And like everything Dale was saying, it was all about inverting power structures. You know, slaves were freed for a little bit. Sometimes their masters would serve them. It really essentially what was going on was that the reign of Jupiter, the king of the gods, Zeus, right? It was upended, and his father Saturn was sort of taking over after many years of being deposed by Zeus. So he kind of took over for that week of the festival of Saturnalia. Back then, people were hitting each other with sticks quite a lot too. They were often covered with goat's blood as a way to promote fertility. But over time, these celebrations became more and more domestic. So people were celebrating more and more in their homes rather than publicly. And that was because of all that violence Dale was talking about. All over the world, this was happening. The phrase goodwill toward men, which you've probably heard a number of times, that was a bunch of drunk men banging on doors and demanding alcohol. And in fact, the poem called A Visit from St. Nicholas, which is usually called The Night Before Christmas, is all about the anxiety of hearing this stuff outside. Near the beginning, the narrator's in bed and he hears a loud noise outside and he's terrified. That's an attempt to overwrite the old traditions of public debauchery and violence and make them more domestic. We have a mixture of that still today. So what's going on is that we have a series of small rituals that we perform in public, leading up to a very private final ritual on Christmas Eve and into Christmas morning. And it all begins with what we can think of as the parade Santa, right? We have a lot of these here. I did not know that there were so many small town parades until just this year. I haven't been able to do much field work with this. Most of the interviews I've done and the data I've collected is pretty old now because of the pandemic. So what I found was that Newfoundland has a lot of small town parades, and I love this. This is from the big one in St. John's. I was at one just day before yesterday in Torbay. Really interesting stuff. So this is the kickoff to the season, right? In the United States, the big one is the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So at the end of November and early December, people start making Santa Claus a public figure. Sometimes before that, Santa Claus will appear in shopping malls, right? And this is the second of the rituals. This is, some kids are really into it and they love it. Some kids are absolutely terrified of this. So it's the second part of the ritual. So parents put their children on the laps of these men, and they're enacting this drama. This is the second stage of the ritual, and it goes on, right up until Christmas Eve. Sometimes the second public one. This can take place in shopping malls. That's, I think, the standard, but it also takes place in some more private affairs like Knights of Columbus halls or something like that. They'll bring, private Santa Claus ceremonies there. Lots of people can attend, but most people don't know about them. And then we've got the final aspect of this ongoing ritual, and that is the Christmas Eve to Christmas morning private ritual. And that begins with quite often baking cookies or something like that and leaving them out, sometimes with carrots. Some families will put glitter on the snow outside their houses so that the reindeers know where to stop. Some parents get into this really, really deeply, and they will go up on the roof so that the kids can hear sounds of Santa Claus moving around up there. They'll put footprints in the snow, and they definitely eat the cookies and drink the milk if that's what's left out. all of which leads to the following morning when the children come out and they see the presents under the tree, right? So this is just a general version of what happens in a lot of Christmas ceremonies. And that brings to the end the Santa Claus component of it. We could talk about a lot of different ways this plays out in what we think of as different communities. For example, coworkers will have their secret Santa, or sometimes a gift exchange called White Elephant or Dirty Santa, where people are bringing gifts and there's some sort of competition about who can get the best one. So there's all sorts of these things. They show up in lots of different places, and Santa does show up, right? And leading up until Christmas morning. Children have to go to sleep, and that's when all of the work is done by the parents. Janet mentioned my work with Superman, and this is how I got to Santa Claus, by the way. I was noticing some similarities between them. They have Arctic homes and they can fly and all these things, but I started watching Superman shows and reading the comic books, and what I found was that Superman will often fill in for Santa Claus. If Santa Claus is incapacitated. There was a show called Smallville a few years ago, and one episode Santa was too drunk to deliver all the presents, so Superman had to do it for him. But what was really interesting was when I was interviewing a writer named Chris Roberson, who said he said that he wants to live his life like Superman is real, and in fact, he thinks that there is a reality to it all because, like Santa Claus, we need to do the things necessary to make Superman real. And so I'm just applying that here. Parents, commercial entrepreneurs, grandparents, uncles, aunts, we all do these things to make Santa Claus real for the children. And it's very much complicating that notion that kids who are around the ages of 7, 8, 9, that's what the research says is when children stop believing if they aren't convinced otherwise earlier on. So that's what's happening on Christmas Eve, is that the most important part of the ritual is done by caregivers, parents usually. So I'm interested in ritual, and so I find these sorts of things. This was a Facebook post a few years back. Not to read the whole thing, just sum up. A mother recommending a pattern that you can do with your kids when your kids start not to believe. You take them out for coffee. Which is a very adult thing to do, right? So essentially it's a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. Then they explain that Santa Claus isn't magical or anything like that, but in fact is grown-ups doing these things to make Santa Claus real. And that you're indoctrinating the child, you're initiating them into this adulthood and essentially making them into Santa Claus, right? The end result is that they're now performing these same behaviors. They're doing the things that make Santa Claus real for children who still believe in him. Really fascinating stuff. The kid from this is now grown up and continues this tradition with his own children. I look for all kinds of different types of culture, so I find these kids' jokes for Santa Claus. How much did Santa's sleigh cost? It was on the house. What's his favorite type of music? Rap. Then a grammar joke, right? What do you call Santa's little helpers? Subordinate clauses. So Santa shows up in all of these different aspects of culture. He's really important in terms of something called the Christmas spirit, which is hard to define, but it's generally, the way I think of it is that we all embody the ideals of culture embodied by Santa Claus, right? So he sets an example that people try to follow, and it's interesting to see these sorts of things turned on their heads with movies like Bad Santa and some of the memes that are sort of against Christmas. Dale brought up food. I thought this was an interesting way to think about Santa Claus in terms of the foods that are left out for him, all sorts of cakes. And I'm running a little bit late here, so I'll just go to this last slide I've got for you, which shows sort of the contradictions inherent in it, as well as some of the different ways Santa appears. Really fascinating memes, right? People posting these things all over the internet. Santa Claus doesn't exist, but he still eats your milk and cookies, right? We know that there's this tension created by the belief in Santa Claus, and as a culture, I think the world is largely still struggling with this. Should we promote belief in Santa Claus? Should we, tell children right away that he is just a bunch of people working together to try to make life magical for them? And so that's where I'll end today. I don't have any answers for that question or what Santa Claus's place should be. I think we all get to decide for that ourselves, and that's the great thing about it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. Now, we're going to go to, we don't have a lot of questions. So anyone that has a burning question for Dale or Daniel, please post it in the chat or the Q&A. I just really want to briefly say thank you to both of you. And thank you to our sponsor for today, which is Johnson Insurance offers Memorial University alumni specially designed policies and preferred rates on home and auto insurance and travel insurance. And there is a number there if you would like to call for more information. And there's also a web link. So over to questions now. We do have a few. And we have some comments, and people have really been enjoying this presentation. So thank you both again. Let me just go over to my other screen to find my, okay. Question. Would be interested to know how we transition from a religious figure to the Coca-Cola version of Santa. Was there always a gift of money or food or goods? And how did charity become commercial? Great question.
Wow, that is a great question, and it would take a couple of days to answer if we want to get into all of the stages involved in there. The Coca-Cola Santa started in the early 20th century as an outgrowth of a very political use of Santa Claus in the 19th century by a cartoonist called Thomas Nast, who was working for in New York magazines and journals and things like that. And he used Santa Claus in a very specific way to criticize, for example, the American South during the Civil War. This guy was unbelievably influential. Every U.S. president he endorsed became president after he endorsed them. So he was really influential in elections. The corruption of the politics during that time was gigantic, and they feared him. The guy who just drew pictures. So he kind of crafted the first Santa Claus that we would recognize as Santa Claus rather than a bishop. And that happened in the early 19th century and into the later half of it. And then we would need to really dig into the doings of a bunch of men in the New York Historical Society at the beginning of the 19th century for that as well. And it has to do with 17th century fervor for patron saints among British colonies. So, England had St. George, and Ireland had St. Patrick, and Scotland had St. Andrew, and Wales had St. David. So the New York Historical Society, they wanted to have an American saint, and they picked Nicholas because he was so popular in churches. And so they encouraged people to go to churches all throughout December and to participate in sort of on St. Nicholas's Day, which is December 6th. We just missed that one from yesterday. So like I said, we'd have to get into all of this stuff, plus the domestication of, well, not domestic, the shifting of children's status as just little adults and into a recognized different category in their role in factories is really complicated. And I'm afraid I can't give you too much more without really digging into all this stuff. So basically it happened in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries as a result of industrialization and the New York Historical Society, if that makes any sense. A bunch of guys who just really liked St. Nicholas, one of whom was Clement Clark Moore, who wrote the Night Before Christmas poem, and another was Washington Irving, who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So I'll stop talking about that now.
Oh, that's so fascinating. We had another question, a similar question. So that's great. So interesting. Dale, there's a question here about Tibbs Eve. Can you kind of speak to, sorry, I'm getting questions popping up now all over the place. Hold on a second. Can you explain the origins of Tibbs or Tibbsy Eve, Dale?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tibbs Eve means two very different things. So just to kind of start, it is both It's both kind of an expression, a phrase that is used, and then it also now in Newfoundland and Labrador kind of refers to this holiday. Um, Tibbs Eve, Philip Hiscock, who was a retired folklorist from MUN, archivist at the MUN Folklore and Language Archives. I know Philip has a great interest in kind of the history of this. Tib was a character in kind of early modern English plays. So Tib was kind of a code word for a wanton woman, a woman of loose morals. So if you didn't want to use the word harlot or whore, you would refer to this character as a tib. So then the idea of a Tibbs Eve or a Saint Tib is kind of a play on an impossible thing. So a Saint Tib would be a holy whore, if you will, if I can use that expression. So a Tibbs Eve, then, a Saint Tibbs Eve, became an expression for an impossible day or a day that would never arrive. So if I owed Daniel some money, I would say, "Oh yeah, Dan, I'll pay you back on Tibbs Eve," and he would know that he was never going to see a saint from me. And so this idea of a day that would never come eventually came to be associated around Christmas time. Like it would be a day between one year and the next, sort of like, again, a kind of a day that didn't really exist, and it kind of got tacked on to the end of the year. And then starting around, kind of the 1940s, 1950s on the south coast of Newfoundland, this expression for a day that would never arrive, that was associated with Christmas in some way, really got pinpointed to a day that people would kind of take as the first day of Christmas. So it became, because people, if you were a very devout Christian, you would not partake of drink until Christmas time. And so Tibbs Eve was kind of a day in advance of Christmas where you could kind of semi-legally kind of have a little drink. And then it kind of exploded from there. It's just kind of an excuse to start the Christmas holidays, and even a day earlier, the eve before Christmas Eve. And then this wonderful thing happened that I guess linguists and folklorists would call folk etymology, where people started to say things like tipsy Eve and say, oh, well, it has to do with drunkenness. And that's something that really has only evolved since maybe the 1980s and 1990s. But it's something that you will see all the time, especially on social media. If you go online and do a Google search for Tibbs Eve or Tipsy Eve, you'll see this explanation. Oh, it was an excuse for men to go out and get drunk. So the tradition, has these very ancient roots, but it is a tradition that is constantly now in evolution. And what we've started to see as well over the last very few years is that people have started to associate Tibbs Eve. It's almost swung the other way. Now Tibbs Eve or Tipsy Eve is a day that people use for fundraising for local charity. So again, we kind of see this swing back from kind of wantonness back to respectability, and all this great kind of folklore that springs up around it. So the roots are very old. How we explore it and celebrate it in Newfoundland and Labrador is very modern.
So interesting. We've got a couple of questions about mummering, so I'm going to combine them into one. Mummering, what were the influences that initiated mummering here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and how prevalent do you think mummering is in Newfoundland today, considering people's faces and voices are covered, and are people that keen to let people into their house? So I guess that's Dale.
So the first thing I'll say is people always like to know what's the origin of X, Y, and Z. And as Daniel was saying, it's always very, very complicated. So what we think of as mummering today, this idea of a disguised house visit tradition, is really only something that has become prevalent since the 1980s. I think before that point, mummering was really very complicated. And one of the early studies of mummering that was done in the 1960s by Herbert Halpert, who founded the folklore department, he kind of said mummering is all these different kinds of things that may involve costume or may not. It may involve a house visit, it may not. So generally this idea of revelry and disguise and kind of ordered chaos, we start to see it in Newfoundland take a form that we would kind of think of as mummering by the end of the kind of 19th century. But it's based on these very old traditions. Most northern European countries have some kind of year-end costumed tradition to mark the end of the year. What we see in Newfoundland is a mix of a couple different traditions. Certainly there is an Irish kind of house visiting play tradition where people would perform a mummer's play. There is a West Country England disguised house visiting tradition. There are various hobby horse traditions, like in Wales, the Mary Lloyd tradition, where people would go house to house with a horse's costume. And all of these things kind of came to Newfoundland and blended in different regions and then became, regionally specific. So what we think of, like, I think if you ask people what a mummer is, and people will say, or a Janny, even the word mummer is kind of only since the 1980s, I think, has mummer kind of been the term that people use to describe mummering, whereas a lot of people used a whole variety of other words like fools, unchicks, darbies, jannies, hobbies, ribbon fools. What we think of as mummers today, this very narrowly kind of defined mummers, is really due to the Mummers song, Bud Davidge's Mummers song, and that there's a Christmas TV special that always gets played, Land and Sea episode that again was filmed in the 1980s. And so what people kind of think of as a mummer is really only a really kind of small part of what mummering was historically and what it is today. This idea, just to finish off, the idea that, mummering today, again, you say, it's in decline, it isn't what it used to be. That is a story that people have been telling about mummering for as long as we have written records about mummering. So people in the mid-1800s were complaining about, mummering isn't what it was in my grandparents' day. And I think, that is part of the tradition. We have this nostalgic view of what Christmas is. And there's always this kind of narrative we tell ourselves that it's not quite what it used to be. And in a way that is correct. Christmas is never like it used to be. It's constantly evolving and constantly changing. I think, if anything, mummering right now in Newfoundland and Labrador is probably more popular than it has been. I think there's been an incredible growth in mummering since the 1980s, for example. And people will say, that's not the way we used to do it. And they're right, but I don't really think that matters. And I think it'll continue to change as we move forward.
Wow, great answer to the last question. Thank you so much to both of you. I can't believe how fast that hour went and how much we've learned about holiday traditions and Santa Claus. And my takeaways are the association with violence and nostalgia, which is sort of the same thing. It's very Christmassy to me.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
That's right. And thanks to everyone out there for attending. This is our last MUNalum 101 for 2021. But we have already several confirmed events for January and February, including a session on smoking and the myths around quitting smoking, a session on cybersecurity, very timely, and a session on fake news. So please keep your eyes on your inbox to register for these events, or visit www.mun.ca/alumni to find out more. And look out for the email that is going to follow up this event, which will include a link to this recording. And I think we're going to include a PDF of both of these presentations. And That's it. So thanks again. And we hope to see you in 2022 for more Alum 101. And thanks again to both of you fellas, and a happy Christmas to everyone and happy holidays. Thanks.